Shooting video on the Fuji X-H1 is like a complicated relationship. There's so much to love about it, the form factor, the quality of the footage, the lens options, but then there is also a lot that just really frustrates the heck out of you. Alright, maybe that was just my complicated relationships. Anyway, there are a heck of a lot of things to love about the X-H1, and it does a heck of a lot of things right, and considering that this is the first Fuji camera that actually is touted as a good video-making device, that's actually something we should be praising. For the first shot off the bow, it does quite a bit that impresses even the stingiest of video camera reviewers, such as myself. But it's a mixed bag, for as mentioned, despite getting a lot right, goodness is this camera ever frustrating to operate. As far as handling and build quality concerns, I have pretty much no complaints with the X-H1. From a hardware perspective, it's a really solid camera. I like the button placements, I appreciate the two dials that control both the ISO and the shutter speed. Everything feels nice and smooth, the camera operates exactly as I expected it to. Other design choices that I liked on the X-H1 include a rear joystick and an easy-to-find quick menu button. Compared to other cameras on the market, there's a distinct lack of buttons overall on the X-H1, which leads to a really nice, smooth final product. I like how clean this makes the camera, but I couldn't help but think this would limit the usability of the camera for quickly adjusting modes or creating custom functions for specific tasks. But before we get too deep into any of that, let's take a look at some of the film simulations. So I have this bird that I decided to shoot because the colors are great, so let's focus on the... So like I was saying, this flower is a great subject because it doesn't move and should serve as an excellent subject for us to compare the differences among the different film simulations that you get with the X-H1. Now on this camera, there are 11 different film simulations including standard and F-Log, and in my opinion, they are all much better than what you normally get with any other camera's built-in looks. These are all very unique, very usable, very pretty film simulations that I can't help but be a fan of. So here we have an example of F-Log, which is really nice that they've included on this camera, but for me, I had a really hard time grading this footage, and it might be because I'm following other log rules that may not apply to F-Log. For example, I generally overexpose with any log profile by about one stop, but here I don't know that that's the right choice. And looking at the footage, I feel like it might have been better if I was just staying at proper exposure. What I want to show actually also is I downloaded a film simulation LUT directly from Fuji to place on top of F-Log, and it actually matches one of the looks that come standard with this camera, and I wanted to show you what they look like side by side. As you can see, the standalone Eterna Fuji LUT on top of the log footage is still way overexposed, and then even on the far right where I brought it down, it doesn't look really anything like the Eterna Cinema film simulation on the far left. Just be aware that overexposing even a little bit in camera when using F-Log is going to result in you needing to bring that way down in post, since it's exacerbated for some reason when doing any type of LUT over it. So the Fuji X-H1 has a feature in the menu called Dynamic Range, which lets you leave it at 100%, which is regular, or you can double it to 200% or quadruple it to 400%. And when I read this feature, I assumed that meant that it would just use the sensor to pull out the shadows better, it would crush the blacks less in standards film simulation. But what it actually does is it just forces your minimum ISO up. So in this shot, I had to use ISO 400 as my base, and the 400% I'd use ISO 800 as my base. And looking at that, I was curious, would it look any different if I just manually changed my ISO and didn't touch the dynamic range? And if you look at these two shots side by side and the previous two shots side by side, you'll notice there isn't a difference. So in video, the dynamic range feature doesn't really do anything except limit how low you can set your own ISO. The Fuji X-H1 is capable of slow motion capture in 1080p, and that's what we have here. Since this is a 4K video export, this 1080 clip is going to appear very small in the frame, but it should give you an idea of what you can expect in terms of quality and what kind of slow motion. This clip in particular is at 120 frames per second, and this next clip is at 60 frames per second. There are a couple other options you can tweak in there. You can go down to 100 frames per second if you like, but this is the top of the slow motion, and quite honestly, it looks quite good. The 120 frames per second looks really nice. The feed itself is very clean. There's no weird pixelation of any kind, so it looks really good. If you're shooting in 1080 in slow motion, it looks really nice. If you were curious if the X-H1 had a crop factor difference from shooting stills to video, I wanted to show you what that was. This is a 4K video clip, which is the same crop factor as the 1080 clips, and this is a still image taken from the exact same focal length. As you can see, it's a pretty considerable crop in, but it's not the worst I've seen. This is already an APS-C sized sensor, so you have to take that into consideration as well when looking at what focal lengths you're working with. So let's take a look at the ISO on this camera. The range that you can use when shooting in video is ISO 200, which is the low, and ISO 25600, which is the high. I found that through the low 200 through 6400, you will probably be very satisfied with the video footage that you get out of this. 6400 is probably going to be your max. After that, things start to look really, really noisy. So at this point, I've covered just about everything the camera does from a straight up video standpoint. We've looked at ISO, we've looked at the film simulations, and even taken a look at some of the frame rate options you can get in 1080. Now, there's a lot about this camera that I like, and I made sure to cover that all the way up to this point. If nothing else, this camera makes really pretty video. But it does have some problems. I mentioned before that this camera is really frustrating to use, and that for me stems from this feeling that a lot of the things that were put into this camera weren't put there thinking about what a video shooter would want to have. I go into greater detail in the written portion of this review, but to summarize quickly, there are several things that bother me. For example, this camera is pretty much unusable from a professional standpoint unless you buy the battery grip. The battery grip is the only thing that can give this camera enough power to actually record 4K video for longer than 15 minutes, and it's the only way for you to get a headphone jack, which is critical for recording any video that you want to use the sound on. There's no dedicated video record button. You have to use the shutter button, which is way too sensitive for this and resulted in me getting a lot of unnecessary clips. This would not be as big of a problem if they had some sort of audio cue that I could rely on where it would tell me it was recording or not recording. There isn't one, and you can't enable one. The focus peaking is great that it's there, but it can be spotty and less accurate at wider angles, and there's no zebra in this. Another thing that bothers me is that the recording timer counts down, not up. I don't know about other shooters, but I personally like to know how long a clip is over how long I have left to shoot on a card. Preferably, I want both somewhere on the camera. It's challenging to keep track of how long a specific clip is, and because this method is less precise, the amount of time recording remaining fluctuates by a second or two every time you finish a clip. Earlier I mentioned a distinct lack of buttons on this camera, and that's because there's not really any additional FN or custom function buttons anywhere. You can, however, remap any of the buttons currently on the camera to do whatever you like, but you are limited because there aren't that many. It took me a while to find the white balance button, mostly because it's completely unlabeled. I wouldn't have known to press right on the little pad next to the menu button had I not looked it up in the instruction manual, something I rarely do for anything. And that's kind of the deal with this camera. You generally have to read about it to know where everything is and custom set everything so that it's perfect for you. It doesn't really have an approachable format out of the box, and I found that disheartening. I'm kind of at an impasse with the X-H1. On the one hand, looking at footage captured on the camera is bliss. Operating it, at least on the surface level, isn't hard to do, and it offers little things that make shooting better. The huge number of aspect ratios, frame rates, and bit rates is great, and the film simulations and inclusion of F-Log deserves applause. On the other hand, the camera is just so damn frustrating to use. If there was ever a camera that felt like video was added on as an afterthought, it's the X-H1. Most of the features that video shooters demand, zebra, dedicated capture buttons, additional custom function buttons, always accurate focus peaking, headphone jack, etc., were not included or hastily added on via the battery grip. Actually shooting with the X-H1 can be a practice in patience and serenity now. But if you really like the Fujifilm interface and that's all you've known, you probably won't care about any of this. The fact that a great stills camera like the X-H1 is also a very good video camera will be enough for you. To read the full written review of the Fujifilm X-H1, head over to imagingresource.com.